What would you do if you found two starving children in the wilderness, knowing that saving them could cost you everything? This is a story about a man who had nothing, who wanted nothing, and who chose to risk it all for two little souls the world had already forgotten. A story set in the unforgiving American frontier of 1872, where mercy was a luxury most men couldn't afford, and family was something you built with blood, tears, and impossible choices. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. James Coltrane was 37 years old and had long ago made peace with dying alone. He'd stopped counting the years since he'd spoken to another human being for more than the time it took to trade pelts for ammunition. His camp that September evening was no different than 100 others before it. A small fire, a bedroll stretched beneath a cottonwood, the carcass of a mule deer hanging from a branch, and the kind of silence that makes a man forget the sound of his own voice. He knelt by the creek, washing blood from his hands, watching the water run red and clear again, red and clear, the way it always did, the way everything always washed away, eventually. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, brush cracking, not the casual movement of an animal, but something deliberate, something trying to be quiet and failing. James didn't move except to let his hand drift toward the rifle, lying in the grass beside him. His fingers had just touched the stock when they emerged from the scrub oak, two shapes small and dark against the failing light. Children. His breath caught. Two little Apache girls, their buckskin dresses torn and filthy, their faces hollowed out by hunger and something worse than hunger. Fear that had burned so long it had become something else. The older one couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but she moved like someone who'd already lived a lifetime. She stepped in front of her sister, this tiny thing, maybe 6, and raised a broken knife with a blade no longer than James's thumb. Her hand shook so violently the knife caught the last rays of sunlight and threw them like sparks. But she didn't lower it. The younger girl swayed behind her, eyes glassy, lips cracked and bleeding. James could count her ribs from 15 feet away. He slowly raised both hands, showing them empty, and stood. The older girl's eyes tracked every movement. She said something in Apache, her voice like gravel, a warning, a plea. James couldn't tell which. He took one step back and sat down, making himself smaller, less threatening. He'd learned that much from the crow. You don't tower over something that's already terrified. The little one collapsed, just folded like all the strings holding her up had been cut at once. The older girl cried out, a sharp, broken sound, but she didn't drop the knife. She crouched beside her sister, trying to shake her awake, and James saw the truth, written all over her face. This child believed her sister was dying, believed it was her fault, believed she'd failed at the one job that mattered. James made his choice in the span of a heartbeat. He moved slowly to his pack, pulled out a strip of dried venison, and set it on the ground between them. Then he backed away. The girl stared at the meat like it might be poison, like kindness itself might be the trap that finally killed them. But her sister wasn't waking up. James went to the fire, poured water from his canteen into his battered tin pot, and set it to boil. He didn't look at them, didn't speak, just moved with the calm deliberation of a man trying not to spook a wounded animal. Minutes passed like hours. Then he heard it. The faint sound of tearing meat. When he glanced over, the older girl had dragged her sister closer. She was chewing a tiny piece of venison, testing it, and then pressing softened bits between her sister's lips, trying to wake her with food and hope and sheer force of will. It was the moment. James Coltrane's life split into before and after. He'd killed men, He'd watched friends die badly. He'd walked away from everything that might have made him human. But watching this child try to save her sister with nothing but a scrap of meat and more courage than most men carried into battle. Something in his chest cracked open, and what poured out felt dangerously close to purpose. He boiled water, made a weak broth with salt and venison, brought it to them in a tin cup, moving like he was approaching a pair of wild wolves. The older girl took it with both hands, her eyes never leaving his face, and tilted it against her sister's lips. The little one coughed, sputtered, swallowed. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and distant, but open. The relief that crossed the older girl's face would haunt James for the rest of his life. As the night deepened, he learned the story in fragments, pieced together through broken Spanish. Hand gestures and the kind of understanding that doesn't need language. Soldados, soldiers or slavers or maybe both, had attacked their band, taken their mother, killed the others or scattered them. The girls had run. They'd been running for days, maybe weeks. They didn't know where they were, didn't know where to go. They only knew their mother had screamed at them to run and not look back, and so they had. And now she was gone, and they were here. And the world had become a place with no safe corners left in it. James sat across the fire from them, watching the way the older girl wouldn't sleep, wouldn't let herself, while her sister curled into a ball and trembled with exhaustion. He knew what he was supposed to do. Find a fort, turn them over to the army or a mission, let someone else handle it. But he'd seen what happened to Apache children in those places. He'd seen the schools that carved the Indian out of them like you'd carve rot from an apple. He'd seen the missions where they learned to be servants in the houses of God and men. And he'd seen the ones who simply disappeared, vanished into the machinery of a country that had decided their people had no right to exist. He made coffee, stared into the fire, made a decision that would change everything. When dawn broke cold and gray over the New Mexico territory, James Coltrane broke camp with two shadows trailing behind him. Two little girls who watched his every move with eyes that expected betrayal, because betrayal was all the world had taught them. He didn't have a plan, didn't have a prayer. He only knew that he couldn't leave them, wouldn't leave them. Some things you don't walk away from, even when walking away is the smart play. Especially then. So tell me something. Have you ever made a choice that you knew would cost you everything, but made it anyway because the alternative meant losing yourself? The first time the younger girl called him Papa, James Coltrane was teaching her how to gut a rabbit. His hands had frozen mid-cut, the knife trembling above the small carcass, and he'd looked at her with eyes that couldn't quite process what he'd heard. She'd gone pale, realizing her mistake, and started to back away. But he'd caught her hand, gently, and nodded once. Just once. "Sí, mija," he'd whispered, and the weight of those two words had nearly crushed him. That was 8 months into their strange new life together, and it was the moment James understood. There was no going back. He'd stopped being a man passing through his own existence and become something he'd never imagined he had the right to be. A father. But fatherhood, he was learning, was a series of small failures wrapped around fierce, desperate love. He braided their hair wrong, twisted it too tight or too loose, until the older girl, who he'd started thinking of as fuerte, would huff with exasperation and redo it herself, her small fingers moving with the muscle memory of a life before him. He burned their meals more often than not. Sage-rubbed venison turned to charcoal, cornbread that could double as ammunition, and the girls would exchange glances that said everything about his incompetence. But he tried. God, he tried. He carved them dolls from cottonwood, crude things with painted faces that looked more demonic than human, and watched Pequeña, the little one, clutch hers like it held her soul together. Fuerte pretended hers was beneath her, that she was too grown for such childish things, but James noticed how she kept it wrapped in her blanket, how her fingers would find it in the dark when thunder rolled across the territory. 2 years passed like water through cupped hands, precious and impossible to hold. The girls grew taller, stronger, their faces filling out with the kind of health that comes from consistent meals and safety, things they'd never known before. Fuerte became a hunter, moving through the brush with the silence her people were famous for, reading tracks James sometimes missed. Pequeña developed a voice, soft and sweet, and would sing while they worked. Apache songs her mother had taught her, mixed with English hymns she'd heard from somewhere, creating melodies that belonged to no world except the one they were building together. And James, the man who'd forgotten how to need anything, found himself needing them with an intensity that terrified him. Every morning, he woke expecting them to be gone. Every night he watched them sleep and wondered how long he could keep this impossible thing alive. But the frontier has a way of collecting debts, and James had borrowed time that didn't belong to him. The world they were hiding from started pressing in at the edges. It began with a trip to a trading post, 2 days' ride from their camp, a ramshackle collection of buildings where James went twice a year to trade pelts for flour, ammunition, and the few supplies they couldn't make themselves. He'd brought the girls this time, a mistake he'd regret, because Pequeña had begged to see a real town, and he was weak against her pleading eyes. They'd tied their horses at the rail, and James had felt the stares immediately. The weight of eyes calculating, judging, finding them wanting. A settler in a stained coat and bourbon breath stepped off the porch and looked at Fuerte and Pequeña like they were curiosities in a traveling show. "Those Apache," his voice carried the kind of casual hatred that didn't need volume. James's hand had drifted to his belt where his knife sat. "They're mine." 2 words, flat, final. The man had measured him, seen something in James's face that suggested pushing further would be unwise, and backed down with a grunt. But the damage was done. As they rode away, bags loaded with flour and coffee, James caught Fuerte watching him, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Understanding, maybe, or the beginning of a question she was afraid to ask. That night, back at camp, she'd sat by the fire and spoken quietly. "The man was angry we were with you." James had nodded, not trusting his voice. "Does that happen often?" He'd looked at her then, this 10-year-old girl with eyes that had seen too much, and answered with the only truth he had. "Often enough." She'd gone quiet, staring into the flames, and when she spoke again, her voice was small. "Do you wish we weren't here?" The question had hit him like a physical blow. He'd crouched in front of her, taken her face in his calloused hands, and said what he should have said 100 times before. "You and your sister are the only good thing I've ever done in my life. You understand me? The only good thing." Tears had slipped down her cheeks, and she'd nodded, and in that moment, James had made a silent vow. He'd move them, take them somewhere the stairs couldn't follow, build them something that looked like forever. But forever was running out faster than he knew. Word traveled in the territories, whispered between trappers, shared in saloons, carried on wind that smelled like violence. The army was consolidating Apache bands, forcing them onto reservations or hunting them into extinction. James heard the stories from a trapper who passed through, a French-Canadian with a scar across his throat who spoke in rasps. "They're sweeping through, mon ami. Anyone with Apache blood they take. Women, children, doesn't matter. The government. She has decided these people are done." James had felt his stomach turn to ice. That night he told the girls they were leaving at first light, moving north, someplace colder, harder to reach, where the army's long arm didn't stretch quite as far. Fuerte had helped him pack without complaint, but he'd caught her slipping something into her dress, a small bundle wrapped in leather. Later, when she thought he wasn't watching, he'd seen what it was. A necklace, turquoise and silver, worked in the Apache style. Her mother's. She'd kept it hidden for 2 years, this tiny piece of a life that existed before him, and now, she held it like a woman holds a rosary before battle. Pequeña had asked why they were leaving. Her voice worried, and James had lied smoothly. "Better hunting up north, mija. More game." But Fuerte had looked at him, and he'd seen the truth in her eyes. She knew. She always knew. They'd made it 3 days north when everything changed. James had been checking their back trail, something he did habitually when he'd spotted them. Riders. 4 of them, moving parallel to their path, staying just visible enough to let him know they were being followed. Not soldiers. Something worse. Bandits, or slavers, or men who'd heard that a lone white man was traveling with Apache children and decided that presented an opportunity. James had felt the old violence rise in him, the part of himself he'd buried when he'd found the girls. He'd killed men before, would kill again if it meant keeping them safe. But 4 against 1 with 2 children to protect were odds that didn't favor anyone. That night he'd built their fire in a ravine with steep walls, positioned himself where he could see anyone approaching, and barely slept. The girls had sensed something wrong. Pequeña, pressed against his side, Fuerte, sitting with her back to a rock, watching the darkness with the same intensity he did. Just before dawn he'd heard it. The click of metal, a hammer being cocked. James had grabbed his rifle and spun, expecting the attack. But what he saw froze every thought in his head. A figure stood at the edge of their camp, silhouetted against the pre-dawn gray. Smaller than the riders he'd spotted. Wrong shape, wrong stance. And then the figure stepped into the dying firelight, and James's world tilted on its axis. It was a woman. Apache. Lean as a knife blade and hard as the desert that had forged her. Her face was scarred, a long mark running from her temple to her jaw. The kind of wound that should have killed her. She wore buckskin and carried a rifle that looked older than James, and her eyes were locked on the sleeping girls with an expression that was hunger and relief and agony all bound together. When she spoke, her voice was rough, like she'd forgotten how to use it. First in Apache, rapid and desperate, then in broken Spanish. "Mis hijas, my daughters." James felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. He didn't need a translation, didn't need an explanation. He knew who she was the same way you know a storm is coming before the first drop of rain falls. This was their mother, the woman taken by slavers 2 years ago. The woman they'd mourned, the woman who, against every impossible odd, had survived and tracked her children across hundreds of miles of wilderness. She'd found them. And now she'd come to take them back. Behind James, Fuerte stirred, woken by the voices. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked at the woman standing in their camp. James watched it happen in slow motion. The confusion, the focus, the moment of recognition that hit her like lightning. Her mouth opened, shaped a single word that came out like prayer and accusation all at once. "Mama." The sound woke Pequeña. She turned, saw the woman, and screamed, not in fear but in joy so pure and overwhelming it shattered the dawn like glass. She scrambled to her feet and ran, and the woman dropped to her knees just in time to catch her, and the 3 of them, mother and daughters, collapsed together in a tangle of arms and tears and words James couldn't understand. He stood there, rifle hanging loose in his hand, watching the family reunite, and felt something inside himself begin to die. Because he knew what came next. He'd always known. This had always been borrowed time, and now the debt was being called in. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman hadn't come alone, and the men who'd been following her were less than an hour behind. Have you ever watched someone prepare to lose everything they love, knowing there's nothing you can say to stop it? That's what the next hour looked like. James stood motionless while the reunion unfolded before him. This collision of past and present that he'd always known was coming, but never truly believed would arrive. The mother held her daughters like she was trying to absorb them back into her body, speaking rapid Apache between sobs, her hands running over their faces, their hair, checking for injuries or changes, trying to account for 2 years of absence in 2 minutes of desperate touch. Pequeña was crying, laughing, talking so fast her words tumbled over each other in a mix of Apache and English, while Fuerte, strong, stoic Fuerte, had buried her face in her mother's shoulder and was shaking with sobs that came from somewhere so deep they seemed to be tearing her apart from the inside. And James just stood there, feeling like a stranger at his own funeral. The woman finally looked up at him, and her eyes were hard. Survivor's eyes, the kind that have seen the absolute worst of humanity and decided to keep breathing anyway. She stood slowly, her daughters clinging to her sides, and studied him with an intensity that felt like being read in a language he didn't speak. When she spoke, it was in Spanish, rough and halting. "You are the one," not a question, a statement of fact. James nodded, not trusting his voice. She took a step closer, and he saw the scars, not just the one on her face, but others hidden under her clothing, written in the way she moved. She'd been through hell and carved her way out the other side. "You took my children when they had no one." Her voice cracked on the word children. James forced himself to meet her gaze. "I couldn't leave them. I'm sorry if I—" She cut him off with a gesture. "Sorry for what? For keeping them alive, for giving them 2 years when they should have died in the desert." Her eyes were wet now, fierce and broken all at once. "I tracked them for 800 miles, through territory where my people are hunted like animals. I have walked with blistered feet and empty stomach, following rumors and prayers because they are my blood and my heart." She paused, her breath ragged. "And every night I prayed to find them safe, to find them alive. I did not pray to find them loved. That was more than I dared hope for." The words hit James like stones. He started to speak, but she held up a hand, silencing him. She turned to her daughters, spoke to them in Apache, her voice gentle now, asking questions. Fuerte answered, glancing between her mother and James, and Pequeña added details in her enthusiastic way, pointing at James, at the camp, at the carved dolls that lay near the bedrolls. The mother listened, her expression shifting through emotions James couldn't name. When the girls finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at the cold fire, at the careful way their camp was arranged, at the evidence of 2 years of makeshift family. Finally, she looked back at James, and something in her face had changed. Softened, maybe, or just accepted the impossible complexity of what stood before her. "They call you Papa," she said, quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation that held the weight of worlds. James felt his throat close. "I never asked them to. I know," she interrupted. "Children do not give that name to someone who does not earn it." She walked closer, and James saw how exhausted she was, how thin, how the journey had carved her down to pure will. "My name is Nalin. It means maiden, though I have not been one for many years." She gave a bitter laugh. "The soldiers took me to sell. I killed 3 before they could ship me south. Then I walked, I stole, I survived. Because my daughters were alive somewhere, and I would find them or die searching. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. I came here to take them, to disappear into what remains of my people's land, and keep them safe from the world that wants us erased. James felt his heart shatter. He nodded, unable to speak, and turned to begin gathering the girl's things. His hands shook as he picked up Pequeña's doll, the one he'd carved with a face that looked nothing like a real child, but that she loved anyway. He was folding their blankets when Nalin spoke again. But I see now that I cannot take them from the only peace they have known. He froze, turned slowly. She was watching her daughters, who had settled by the fire, Fuerte with her arm around Pequeña. Both of them looking between their mother and James with confusion and fear written across their faces. "They love you," Nalin said, and her voice was thick with something that might have been grief or gratitude or both. "And you love them. I can see it in how you move around them, how you made this place safe, how you carved them toys and taught them to survive." She met his eyes. "My daughters need their mother, but they also need the man who became their father when I could not be there." James stared at her, not understanding, afraid to understand. Nalin took a breath that seemed to hurt. "I have no people left, no village to return to. The army has driven us onto reservations or into the ground. I cannot give them the life I was born into, because that life is gone." She gestured around the camp. "But you have built something here. A life, a family, small and strange, but real." Her eyes were shining now. "So I am asking you, James Coltrane, let me stay. Let me be their mother in this family you have made. Because they need us both, and because—" She paused, vulnerable for the first time. "Because I am tired of surviving alone." The world seemed to stop. James opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. Nothing he could say would be adequate for what she was offering, for the bridge she was trying to build between their 2 impossible worlds. So he just nodded, once, hard, and felt tears spill down his face for the first time in years. Pequeña made a small sound and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. And then Fuerte was there too, and Nalin stepped forward and put her hand on James's shoulder. This tentative gesture that felt like a treaty being signed, and for one perfect moment, they were whole. But the frontier doesn't allow perfect moments to last. The sound came from the ridge above them, horses moving fast, at least 4 of them. James's head snapped up, his body going into the coiled readiness of a man who'd lived by violence before he'd learned to live by love. Nalin heard it too. Her hand went to the rifle on her back, and her expression shifted into something predatory. She spoke rapidly in Apache to the girls, who immediately moved to crouch behind a boulder, their training, both hers from before and his from after, taking over. James grabbed his rifle, checking the load, and looked at Nalin. "The men following you." She nodded grimly. "Slavers, the ones who took me. I thought I lost them 3 days ago." Her jaw clenched. "I was wrong. They positioned themselves at the edge of camp, using rocks for cover, and James felt the old familiar calm settle over him, the clarity that comes before violence. Beside him, Nalin checked her rifle with efficient movements, and he realized that whatever else she was also a warrior. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The riders came into view. 4 men, rough-looking, heavily armed, the kind who made their living from other people's suffering. They saw the camp and pulled up short, spreading out in a loose line. The lead rider, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes, called out, We just want the woman, the Apache. Hand her over, and we'll leave peaceful." James felt Nalin tense beside him. He kept his rifle trained on the leader and spoke loud enough to carry. "You're not taking anyone from this camp." The man laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "That's not how this works, friend. She killed 3 of ours. That's a debt that needs settling." James's finger tightened on the trigger. "Then you'd better ride away, because the only thing getting settled here is where we bury you." The tension stretched like wire about to snap. The girls were silent behind them. The morning light was growing stronger, painting everything in shades of gold and blood red. The scarred man's smile faded. "Last chance. We've got 4 rifles to your 2. Those children behind you. They'll watch you both die if you're stupid enough to fight." Nalin spoke then, her voice carrying across the space between them. Cold and certain. "I have died already. Every day for 2 years. You made me into something that cannot die again. So come and try to take me. See what happens to men who touch my children." The moment hung suspended, balanced on the edge of everything, and then the lead rider reached for his pistol, and the morning exploded into violence and gunfire and the sound of everything worth protecting being put to the ultimate test. James fired, worked the lever, fired again, and beside him, Nalin moved like water, like wind, every shot finding its mark, and the 2 of them, this impossible family of broken pieces, made their stand together. The gunfire faded. Smoke drifted across the camp. 3 of the riders were down. The 4th, wounded, was spurring his horse back toward the ridge, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. James and Nalin stood breathing hard, checking each other for wounds, and then turned to the girls who huddled behind the rock, terrified but safe. For now. James helped Nalin lower herself to the ground. She'd taken a bullet in the leg, a through and through that would heal but hurt like hell. As he wrapped it with strips from his shirt, she caught his hand. "They will send more." He nodded. "I know. We cannot stay here. I know that too." That night, after they'd buried the dead and treated Nalin's wound and held the girls while they cried, James and Nalin sat by the fire while Pequeña and Fuerte slept fitfully nearby. The flames cast dancing shadows across both their faces. Nalin stared into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "The soldiers who took me, who started all of this, they are still out there, still hunting." She turned to look at him, and there was something raw and honest in her gaze. "They know I escaped. They know I am a symbol now, a woman who killed slavers and vanished. They will come for me. For us." She paused, and the question that came next carried the weight of everything they'd just fought for. "Will you fight for us, James Coltrane, for my daughters and for this strange family we have built? Will you stand when they come?" James looked at her, at this fierce, broken, beautiful woman who'd survived the impossible and offered him something he'd never thought he deserved. He looked at the girls, sleeping tangled together. Both of them, his and hers and theirs. He thought about the riders who would come, the soldiers, the world that wanted to tear this fragile thing apart. And he gave the only answer that mattered. "Until my last breath." Nalin nodded slowly, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or commitment, or the beginning of something that looked like trust. They sat in silence as the fire burned low, 2 warriors guarding their family, knowing that the peace they'd won today was temporary, that the real fight was still coming, and in the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of horses. Many horses, moving through the night, coming closer, if you want to know what happens when the past comes calling with violence in its heart. when a family built from broken pieces has to face the machinery of a nation that wants them erased, then you need to subscribe to Mr. Wild West right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this story is far from over. Drop a comment and tell me, would you fight for a family that wasn't born from your blood, but from your choices? Because James Coltrane is about to find out exactly what that fight costs. The battle for this family has only just begun, and you won't want to miss what comes next. This is Mr. Wild West, where every story is a bullet, and every word leaves a scar. I'll see you in the next one.